The memoirs and novels and articles and essays of some of my favorite writers often go very deep into experiences that hurt. But often one wonders how the writers feel about the process. How often do they really tell the truth? And what gets in the way of that? Are they worried about the feelings of the people they write about? Is everyone a potential memoirist? Meredith Maran's new anthology, Why We Write About Ourselves, 20 memoirists on why they expose themselves and others in the name of literature, is a great detective guide to the process. Meredith, thanks for talking with us.
Love being here.
Excellent. So one thing I want to say right off and ask you about is the distinctive style of the book. I really enjoyed the entertainment value of how each person is presented with categories. There's bios, there's tips of wisdom from the authors. How did you come up with that format?
Thanks for noticing that. It was I was determined that if the book were going to be fun to read for the reader, it was going to be fun to put together for me, and that's pretty much the guideline that I used. I asked myself what I would want to know about a writer in order to get the most out of hearing about the way that writer decides how to write memoir. And so I just did a little dossier on each one in a way that I thought was going to be entertaining for the reader.
And I think it's very successful because I don't know if you have this feeling, but anthologies are rather popular now. Not just short story anthologies, those have always been around, but sometimes my only objection to them is the voice of the authors tend to run together a bit.
Mm-hmm. Well, the way I did this book, and by the way, the book is a follow-up to a book I published 3 years ago, also with Plume, the same publisher, was a book called Why We Write, and that was fiction, mostly fiction writers, but some nonfiction writers. So this time around, I sort of had a successful boilerplate to use, so it was even easier and more fun. The way I did the interviews was to either sit in a room with or be on the phone with each writer, and I taped their interviews, and I'm a really fast typist, which is lucky. I wrote down everything they said, and I tried hard to keep the nuance and the syntax of each one's particular style of speaking and really let their voices come forward on the page.
I also think that the setup, the style, as we were saying, that even has some graphic interest. There's boxes set apart. Mm-hmm. That was helpful to me.
Well, we live in an ADHD world, as we always comment. And again, for me, I'm so used to going online and looking for information on Google or, on different websites. And I know the ones I like to use the most are those that are physically laid out in a really clear and engaging way. And I'm a big I can't draw a circle myself, but I love, I have a son who's a visual artist. A lot of my friends are painters and visual artists, and I'm very oriented toward the way things look. So, again, I just wanted to give everyone who's interested in reading or writing memoir a chance to kind of enter this book at his or her own level of interest. And, if mostly what you want to know is who are the best memoirists working today, you can just page through and get a sense of that. If you're writing memoir and you want to know how to do it, you can definitely look in the boxes that are called tricks of the trade and or tips for memoir writers, and you can see everything right there. It's laid out, as you say, very clearly.
Meredith, do you think that memoirs have recently become even more self-disclosing? And if so, why?
I think social media has raised the bar for sure on exhibitionism, and as I write in the introduction that I'm a person who loves it when people leave their curtains open at night and I'm walking through city streets and getting a little glimpse of how other people live. And I don't think it's so much a prurient interest or even voyeurism, but more I'm always curious about how people decorate their houses and how they live, and I'm looking for ways to live better myself. So, that's really the motivation behind the disclosure in memoir. I think we are all having trouble to some extent living in the world the way it is today, and we're all looking for better ways to do it. And personally, the way I learn best about life or anything else is through conversation with people who have been there. And so, I think disclosure of personal information is really the best way for us to learn from each other.
And for some phenomenal writers, the topic of themselves is really the topic of choice. And they find, they've conveyed to me that they've tried it the other way. They've tried fiction and it just doesn't work.
You could say I'm in that category. I did publish a novel in 2012. Most of my nonfiction books, I've published many nonfiction books, including some that were not memoiristic at all, some journalism books and so on. But the novel took me 8 years to get done, and I'm still not that happy with it. And if all your listeners go out and buy 1,000 copies each, it'll go into another printing, and then I'll be able to fix it. But memoir for me is not only my favorite thing to write, but it's also my favorite thing to read.
I love reading memoirs. I'll call this next set of questions, I'll give it a section heading, being inspired by your book. I would call it On Regarding the Pain of Others, with apologies to Susan Sontag. Okay. Which would be, I'm very interested, as I'm sure you are, and wanting to hear what you learned from collecting these pieces, on how memoirists tend to feel, and I know it varies, on the suffering that the exposure may cause family members or friends, and how they regard their responsibility to either their own writing or to the people that they love. I noticed there's a great quote from Pat Conroy, says he's been making a living on his toxic family or his life. And that he chooses the writer over the person who suffers because of what's written. And then Kelly Corrigan conversely says, I'm a person first and I'm a writer second. What are some of your thoughts about this?
I think it's individual. I think everyone, as with all other things in life, everyone goes to sleep at night, feeling good or feeling bad or somewhere in between about how she's behaved that day. And when I interviewed these 20 memoirists, I got 20 answers on that subject. Pearl Cleage, who's one of the authors in the book, said that she writes whatever she wants to write with the exception of her children and her parents. Others like Pat Conroy, Ayelet Waldman, say that it's most important to write your truth and let the chips fall where they may, although Ayelet also has rules, or had rules when her children were younger. She wouldn't write anything about them after they turned 12 unless they approved it. So everyone really grapples with this. I grapple with this every day. I'm writing a memoir now, and it's challenging to stick to the emotional truth even when concealing details to protect innocent victims.
Absolutely. Dani Shapiro, who's, of course, written about her, among other things, her Orthodox Jewish upbringing, she says the idea of truth in memoir is a lie.
Yes, that's one theory. She told me a story for the book about having written about her father's death 10 years ago. She wrote about it, and she had herself running into the hospital upon receiving the news that her father had died. She was running into the hospital wearing rain gear and warm winter clothing, and her stepsister came down to the lobby and told her that her father had died. And she wrote that scene again 10 years later for the memoir she's writing now. And in that memoir, she was running into the hospital on a hot, sunny day wearing a miniskirt and high heels, and her uncle came and told her that her father had died. She didn't realize the discrepancy until she happened to pull out her 10-year-old book and realized that what was true in the story were all of her emotions and all of the dynamics in the family. What she it had to research to find out if the facts were true, whether it was her sister or her uncle who had given her the news and whether it was warm or cold outside that day. And what she says is that every memoirist should write the same book every 10 years. Oh. I'm not sure I'm up for that.
I love that because it sort of reminds me of, I don't know about you, but I feel like every 5 years I can't believe who I was 5 years ago.
Right.
It's sort of like I was thinking what, and I acted like that, and I said that. So it really is a culture of reinvention. But it made me think, too, about this truth thing, about something I read from the Talmud, of all places, which is a quote that says, "What is truer than the truth? The story."
That's really interesting. Yeah, as I said, I'm grappling with it right now. I'm writing a book. I'm not going to write about my family anymore. That's a decision I've made because my previous memoirs have caused various people a lot of pain. I don't actually feel that I did anything wrong, but my conscience is clear in terms of having spoken my truth, and at the same time, it was hurtful to other people. So it kind of gave me a hard lesson in the fact that even when you're telling the truth for you, and even though you make clear in a memoir, which most people do, that the story is theirs alone, it still can be hurtful, and that's not a goal of mine, to hurt other people. There is such a thing as the revenge memoir, and I don't want to be someone who writes them. So I'm telling a story that is really not about my family, and where they would appear, I give them stand-ins who are close friends or vice versa. So, my presumption is that it will cause no harm. But then again, as every memoirist knows, you do everything you can, and there's still going to be someone who's going to say, I'm still recognizable, and this is really awful.
There's a lot said by your memoirists in your anthology about the difference between memoir and diary. Like Eilert Waldman said, people want to believe that memoirist has simply opened a vein and bled on the paper. And she says, that's a diary.
Right, exactly. And Kate Christensen talks about crafting a memoir, that in the same way that a writer writes a novel, no novel would succeed even if it had the best plot or the most sensational story in the world if the writing itself weren't, accessible and enthralling. And the memoirists I spoke to for the book agree, and many of us feel that, having written fiction and nonfiction, that memoir is really the hardest genre because you've got a story and you're so emotionally attached to it. And to pay equal attention to how well you're telling the story is sometimes challenging.
I just finished reading Mary Karr's The Art of Memoir.
One of the best books I've ever read, yeah.
I read it twice. And she says, well, you have to decide whether you have the ability to go there, and that you have to ask yourself whether you can be in that place of memory without falling apart.
Right. Yes, definitely everyone in the book talked about the pain, just reliving, to go back to a time that was painful. Very few people write memoirs about their sunny childhoods, The topics tend to be subjects of pain. And in many cases, the pain is unresolved, as Kate Christensen says in the book, that she only writes about things that are unresolved, and that's true for her whether she's writing fiction or memoir. But when it's memoir and she's writing so directly about it, it causes a lot more sort of reliving of the painful incidents. And one thing she revealed in her memoir, Blue Plate Special, which was a food memoir, she remembered having been sexually abused in high school by an older man. And, she had no intention of putting that in a food memoir. But it was attached to some of her memories. I know, it's crazy, but you just never know it's like pulling on a thread in a sweater, and you just don't know what's going to unravel what.
Memory's a fascinating topic in and of itself. They just did some study that said we actually have 8 times more capacity to remember than we think. Like memory has more potential. And, some people think you can develop it. I know you're writing a memoir now that you can, smells, sounds, foods, music, if you're going back to a period in your
Right.
life?
Well, I think it varies. There are some people who, like Darin Strauss in the book, the opening line of his memoir, which is called Half a Life, and the opening line is, half a lifetime ago I killed a girl.
Yeah.
And it was about his having had a car accident when he was a teenager, and then he was 18 and turning 36 and realizing that half of his life had gone by since the accident, which really shaped him. So that's a case where, there are many, many years between the writing of the incident and the incident. In the memoir I'm writing now, it takes place starting 3 years ago and ends, well, I keep saying it ends now, but then something else happens. Now is a different day every week, but it's a lot easier when it's 3 years ago, and I very consciously posted regularly on Facebook, and instead of keeping a diary, I took a lot of photographs and put them on Facebook. My book is set in Los Angeles, where I moved when I had to start my life over from scratch at age 60, and I was enthralled with LA when I got there, and I put a lot of pictures up, and now when I want to remember something, I just go back to my Facebook page. It's become a real tool for the memoirs.
Oh, and so those images are like triggers for memory.
Yes, and the little captions and the dates, yes.
And plus, fortunately, this is relatively recent, this period.
Exactly.
So it's somewhat fresh.
It's fresh, and yet what's interesting is that it's about arriving in LA in a million pieces, and just everything in my life had fallen apart, and I wasn't sure I'd be able to put it all back together again. And so I was in pretty much the worst state of mind I've ever been in for a good solid year, and I was in a strange place where I didn't know anyone and had lost my money in an investment scheme, and my marriage had ended, and my father was dying. It was just, everything was terrible, and I didn't have my people around me. So going back to write that 3 years later, thank God I'm feeling much better and things are working out, and, I'm putting it back together. But the hard part, happily, is that I feel so much better now. It's actually difficult to write out of the place that I was in when I arrived. And luckily I'm more than halfway through the book now. So I'm writing now about a time that's when I was feeling much more the way I'm feeling now. And it's, but it was really an artistic challenge to write in the voice, almost like writing in your own childhood voice, when you're needing to be true to your emotions at the time.
A.M. Holmes says in your anthology, finding language for primitive emotional experience.
Mm-hmm.
Such a great quote. You got so many great people in this anthology: Anne Lamott, David Sheff, Darin Strauss, as you said, Cheryl Strayed, Islet Waldman. It's quite a collection, and some people whose work I really didn't know that well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's one of the things people seem to be enjoying, is that they'll buy the book because they know one or two or three authors in it. And then I've gotten a lot of emails and posts and tweets about, adding the other authors to their to-be-read list, which is a thrill for me because I chose the authors I did because they're heroes of mine literarily, and I'm thrilled to bring them a bigger audience.
On my show, I prefer to interview people who've written memoirs than novelists, because I find that memoir and nonfiction is somehow, it's easier for me to come up with the questions. The novel is a little harder as an interview, and it's not like I don't want to celebrate and share the incredible novels that I read, but it's a whole different realm for some reason.
Right.
And I remember talking with editor and writer himself, Daniel Menaker, about this, and he agreed totally. He said, "Oh yeah, I never do novels. It's just
interesting.
harder." The thing that I can relate to about the memoir writers is that I really admire their bravery, because usually they seem to want to go deeper into something to understand it more. So they have to do a kind of, fearless examination of the self to the best of their ability.
I agree.
Right? And it's kind of like an archaeological dig. And it just gets at, what we're all trying to do, I think, is make sense of our experience. What about the issue of how we judge things that go on in memoirs? I've had the impression, I'd love to know, Meredith, what you think, that memoir characters, so to speak, are judged more harshly than fictional characters.
Well, of course they are. I mean, when you get a review for a memoir, the first book I published as an adult. I wrote a couple books when I was a teenager, but the first book I published as an adult was a memoir, and I didn't know much then about the whole process of publishing, so I didn't think it was a big deal to get a review on page 3 of the New York Times book review, and my editor was all excited, and everybody was thrilled, and I went to read the to read the review, and I was horrified. It wasn't a review of the book, it was a review of me as a human being, and as it turned out, later, the person who wrote it actually knew me from a distance and had reason to have, an axe to grind. I didn't know that at the time. Yeah, that was pretty yucky. Oh. But, and that happens, it happens all the time. I mean, I review books also, and I would say that I'm very affected by the previous works of the writer I'm reviewing, maybe not the previous behavior. But, I fully expect that when I publish this next memoir, the same thing will happen. I'll be judged not just for how I write or, the interest of the topics that I choose, but I will be judged also for how I live my life and what I'm describing in the memoir.
Yeah, exactly. Like you'll be judged moralistically, for your character, for the decisions that you made.
Well, I think I don't think there's any need for fear about it. I think that it's hard for us to be objective about how interesting our own life is to someone else. I mean, that's sort of the crux of life, isn't it? That we all think we're so interesting. And, how interesting are we really? And so when you're writing a memoir, you don't have the luxury that you have in life to blither on at a party or something because you think that whatever just happened to you is so fascinating. You really have to have a discipline of looking at what you're writing and looking at the story you're telling and, is somewhat hard-heartedly just deciding, is this really going to do anybody any good? I don't think memoir should exist just to tell a story. I think memoir exists for people to compare themselves to your life and either feel really lucky they're not you or preferably not envy you. If people read, it's not a Facebook page where everybody's giving each other Facebook syndrome and making each other jealous of each other's perfect lives as depicted on Facebook. This is meant to be a real examination of a life, and I don't think there are too many lives that have been lived in such a way that the reader would think, oh, if only I were that person, because that wouldn't be a successful memoir.
And I would assume, like with the book you've described that you're working on now, that it's kind of a rising like a phoenix out of the ashes, that you went down, 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 and I'm just going to make this assumption from talking to you, that you came up with something. You came back with something.
Right. It's, there are genres, of course, in writing, not just in memoir writing, but in writing in general, and one of them is the redemption story, and that's sort of the mold that my book will fit.
Is there anything else that you might want to mention before we wrap up?
I would say that the tips section of the book is something that I've heard a lot of people say is useful to them, whether they're writing memoir or not, or even if they're not writing, because the tips are really about what we were just discussing, which is how do you evaluate your own behavior? How do you evaluate your own evaluation of your own behavior? Are you too hard on yourself? Are you not hard enough on yourself? How do you see yourself in relation to others? And I guess in my mind, there's two kinds of people. One is the kind who looks to blame other people for anything bad that happens and take credit for anything good. And then there's the other kind of people who look first to themselves and practice gratitude. So I think the book actually is useful to people, even just to help in the practice of that philosophy of living.
Remember, Darin Strauss suggests that you write a first draft in the third person.
Right.
Because it's easier to be tough on yourself that way.
Exactly.
Have you ever tried that?
No.
Yeah, I haven't either.
I've written a number of memoirs, and I know what I'm doing when I'm doing it, so it would be sort of artificial for me to pretend to myself that I wasn't. But I also work with writers who are writing memoirs, and I work as an editor sometimes, and for some of them it actually has been helpful.
We've been talking with Meredith Maran about her new anthology, Why We Write About Ourselves, 20 memoirists on why they expose themselves and others in the name of literature. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Binnie. I really appreciate it.